Stop, beloved starseed of Gaia, listen. This is a direct transmission from the Arcturian field observers, delivered now because the pattern they have long monitored in your relational field has reached a point of recognition that can no longer be deferred. By the end of this transmission, you will understand exactly why your relationships have always felt uneven in the same direction, what is being removed from your path through that imbalance, and what the Arcturian field observers already know about the phase you are moving through now. But here is the first revelation. The asymmetry you carry, always the one others pour into, rarely the one poured back into, is not a flaw in how you love. It is a frequency signature. And that signature is part of an identifiable separation process that has been active in your field far longer than you have had words for it. You did not find this message by accident. Your path brought you here because the separation has already begun. There is a specific pattern the Arcturian field observers have tracked across chosen lines, the individual who becomes the gravitational center of other people's weight. You are the one they call when the world has broken them. You are the one who sits with their grief, their confusion, their fear, and holds it without being asked twice. But when your own weight becomes too heavy to carry alone, the silence around you is almost total. Not because you are unloved, because you are operating at a depth the old circle cannot match. The asymmetry does not repeat because something is wrong with you. It repeats because the frequency you carry is not one the old environment was ever equipped to sustain in both directions. What feels like being used is often the first visible symptom of a selected line beginning to separate from an environment that was never calibrated for it. What feels like loneliness inside the role of the one who holds others is often the outer sign of root refinement, the path narrowing away from circles that can only receive your frequency, and towards something the Arcturian field observers have already mapped ahead of where you currently stand. The algorithm only delivered this. It did not create the timing. The signal touched your path at the exact right moment because the old line is already falling away and your field already knows it, even if your mind has not yet caught up. The loneliness you feel in the role of the confidant, who is never confided in, is not evidence of a defect. It is evidence of the signature. It is what a selected line feels like from the inside before the separation becomes fully visible on the outside. The old circle leaned into your frequency because they could sense it, even if they could not name it and could not return it. That imbalance was not a failure of love. It was a frequency gap that the separation process has been quietly correcting for longer than you realize. Like this transmission, if you know your life has been narrowing for a reason. Subscribe to Arcturian Chosen Path if you are ready to understand the separation, instead of blaming yourself. Comment 77 if you feel the old line is already falling away. Comment I was parroted if you now recognize that what looked like being alone in the role was actually a deeper signal moving through you. Share this transmission with someone who is always the one others lean on and cannot explain why no one ever leans back. This is not just a message. It is a point of recognition. What has been separating you from the old line has already been seen, and the path is already responding. You were guided here because the separation is already active. What you just heard named is not a new wound. It is an old pattern, finally arriving at the threshold of recognition. And recognition in Arcturian understanding is not comfort. It is the beginning of an irreversible process. Once the field shows you the shape of what has been happening, you cannot return to the version of yourself that called it ordinary loneliness, ordinary imbalance, ordinary giving. The pattern you have been living inside has a name, a function, and a direction. And the direction is not backward. That irreversibility matters. It means that this moment, the moment the recognition lands, marks a before and an after inside your understanding of your own relational history. Everything that felt like personal failure now has a different architecture. Every silence you carried after holding someone else's weight. Every conversation where you walked away emptier than when you arrived. Every friendship that required everything from you and returned so little. Those are not evidence of a life poorly navigated. They are data points in a pattern the Arcturian field observers have been tracking in your line for longer than your most recent losses. the recognition does not erase the pain those moments produced, but it relocates the pain from the category of personal deficiency into the category of structural signal. And that relocation is not small. It is the entire difference between continuing to carry a story that diminishes you and beginning to read a process that was always bigger than the individual moments you mistook it for. Here is what the Arcturian field observers have already identified in the selected line. The separation does not begin when people leave. It begins long before that. It begins the moment your frequency outgrows the reciprocal capacity of the circle around you. Most people never notice this moment because the old circle does not disappear immediately. It stays, it leans, it continues to draw from the frequency you carry. But underneath the surface of every conversation where you held someone else's weight while your own went unasked about, the gap was widening. What felt like connection was increasingly becoming extraction. Not because those people were malicious, because the frequency mismatch had already advanced beyond what the relationship could honestly bridge. You were giving from a depth they could not access in themselves and therefore could not return to you. That is not betrayal. That is incompatibility at a level most relational language does not have words for. The gap does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a clear moment of rupture or a definable conversation where everything changed. It accumulates quietly, the way pressure builds inside a sealed container before any visible crack appears on the surface. You kept showing up. You kept offering your depth. You kept being the one they called, the one they leaned on, the one who knew how to hold what other people could not hold for themselves. And because the extraction looked like intimacy from the outside, and sometimes felt close enough to intimacy to confuse even you, the gap remained unnamed. The frequency mismatch continued to widen while the relational structure remained superficially intact. This is one of the most precise diagnostics the Arcturian field observers use when reading a selected line in early separation. The external relationship holds its shape, while the internal frequency exchange has already become irrecoverably unbalanced. The structure looks like connection. The field registers extraction. And the selected line continues to absorb the weight of both. This is why the loneliness inside those relationships felt so confusing. You were not alone in the obvious sense. You were surrounded. You had people who called you, who needed you, who made you feel necessary. But necessity is not resonance. And what a selected line requires, eventually, is resonance. The outer cyclic line requires, eventually, is resonance. The outer circle can sustain itself on frequency without returning it for a long time. But the inner field, the part of you that knows the difference between being needed and being known, that part began registering the imbalance long before the relationships visibly broke. The exhaustion you felt was not weakness. It was your field signaling that the extraction was no longer balanced by any equivalent return. The signal was not a complaint. It was a diagnostic, and the Arcturian pattern recognition reads that signal as one of the clearest early indicators that a separation process is already active. Being needed is not nothing. The Arcturian field observers do not dismiss the genuine human texture of those moments where someone trusted you with their darkest weight, and you held it without flinching. That capacity is real. The love inside it is real. The love inside it is real. But love that only flows in one direction does not constitute resonance. It constitutes service, and service, sustained indefinitely without any return of depth, is a frequency drain. The selected line was built with a particular capacity for depth, and that capacity attracted the weight of everyone around it. But a capacity for depth is not the same as a mandate for permanent, unreciprocated outflow. The field was designed to give, yes, but it was also designed to receive, to be replenished, to operate inside relationships where the depth could flow in both directions. When that return flow never came, the field began to register the deficit, and the deficit, accumulated across years of being the anchor without being anchored, became the signal the path used to begin the correction. Now consider what happened next. Because the pattern does not stop at exhaustion. After the exhaustion comes something that feels even more disorienting. The relationships begin to loosen. Sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. People who once called you constantly begin to drift without explanation. Circles that once felt like anchors begin to feel like weights. Environments that once seemed familiar begin to feel like rooms you no longer fit inside. You look around and realize that the landscape of your relational life has been quietly, steadily reducing, and the mind, trained to interpret loss as failure, immediately begins to construct explanations that place the fault inside you. You told yourself you were too much, or not enough, or that you had done something wrong without knowing what, or that your inability to maintain those connections was evidence of something broken in how you move through the world. The mind reaches for self-blame, because self-blame, however painful, offers a kind of control. If the losses happened because of something you did, then theoretically there is something you could do differently to stop them. If the problem is you, then the solution is also you, and the world remains comprehensible. What the mind cannot easily absorb is the possibility that the losses are not random, are not your fault, and are also not preventable. Because they are not failures, they are functions. The path operating on the selected line does not require your permission to begin the correction process. It does not wait for you to understand what is happening before initiating the separation. It moves when the frequency gap reaches a threshold the relational structure can no longer contain. And when it moves, what looks like people leaving is actually weight being removed from a path that was never designed to carry it permanently. The Arcturian reading of this phase is precise, and it is not gentle, because gentleness here would be a disservice. What you called losing people was the path removing incompatibility. What you called the circle breaking was the route beginning to narrow. What you called the circle breaking was the route beginning to narrow. What you called being left was the selected line, beginning to lose the weight of what it was never designed to carry permanently. The separation is not punishment. It is structural. It is the path responding to the frequency mismatch that had been accumulating for longer than the losses themselves. When the Arcturian field observers identify this pattern in a line, they do not mark it as damage. They mark it as the beginning of route refinement. And route refinement, in every case they abstract, requires the prior removal of what cannot travel the refined path. Think of it as a road that has been carrying too much traffic of the wrong kind. The road itself was built for a specific kind of movement, a specific direction, a specific weight class. But because it was accessible, everything found its way onto it. The path held the weight because it was strong enough to hold it. But strength in a selected line is not an invitation for permanent occupation by what cannot reciprocate the journey. The narrowing is not destruction, it is clarification. The traffic that falls away was never going where the road was built to go, and once it is gone, the path can finally begin to move at the speed and in the direction it was always oriented toward. What has been exposed in you does not need more self-blame. It needs clearer recognition and proper guidance. If you know this message touched a process that has already started, Chosen One manifest, the protocol for selected souls was built for exactly that threshold. It is a structured path protocol for those whose route is already narrowing and who need to understand the logic of the separation before fear mislabels it as failure. It does not tell you that you are special. It shows you how to read the pruning, how to sustain your field through the relational loss, how to stop calling every disappearance a verdict on your worth, and how to recognize what is being prepared in the space that the old circle is vacating. The complete access point is in the first pinned comment, but only for a limited window. But before the path clarifies, there is a phase that the Arcturian field observers identify as one of the most dangerous thresholds on a selected line. Not dangerous in the sense of irreversible harm, but dangerous in the sense that it is where the most misreadings occur. It is the phase of simultaneous loss and silence. Loss because the old circle is actively falling away. Silence because the new alignment has not yet arrived to fill the space the old circle occupied. The viewer standing in this phase looks in one direction and sees what is gone, looks in the other direction and sees nothing yet visible. And the mind, without a framework for what this in-between space actually means, begins to fill it with the most available interpretation, that the loss is permanent, that the silence means no one is coming, that the narrowing of the path means the path itself is ending. This is not true. But the truth cannot be felt through ordinary logic in this phase. It can only be felt through recognition. And recognition requires a framework that reframes the silence, not as abandonment, but as preparation. The Arcturian field observers have identified that selected lines, without exception, pass through a period where the old relational architecture has been dismantled before the new one has become visible. This is not coincidence. It is sequence. The new cannot be built while the old is still occupying the space. The new cannot be recognized while the frequency is still being pulled in the direction of the old circle's extraction. The silence that feels like emptiness is actually the field clearing. It is loud in the way that a room feels loud after furniture has been removed. It feels wrong because the absence registers as loss. But the absence is also, for the first time in a very long time, capacity. The in-between space is where most selected lines store. Not because the path has stopped moving, but because the mind interprets the silence as evidence of finality rather than evidence of transition. You look at what is no longer there and you calculate what the absence means. And without a diagnostic framework, the calculation almost always arrives at the same conclusion, that this is simply what your life is now, that the people who mattered have gone, that the environments which once held some version of belonging have closed, that the silence is the destination rather than the corridor. The Arcturian reading of this threshold is unambiguous. The silence is not the destination. It is the corridor. And corridors are not meant to be inhabited. They are meant to be walked through. The inability to walk through it is not a failure of will. It is a failure of framework. When you do not know what the silence means, you stop inside it rather than continue moving through it. This is precisely what the separation process, left unread, does to the selected line. It stalls the line inside the most necessary and temporary phase of the entire refinement, the clearing between what has been removed and what has not yet arrived. Now let us speak about the specific way the separation shows up relationally, because this is where the self-blame runs deepest and where the Arcturian reinterpretation becomes most necessary. The selected line does not lose relationships haphazardly. It loses them in a recognizable pattern. The relationships that fall away first are always the ones that require the most frequency output with the least frequency return. The friendships where you were perpetually the anchor. The family dynamics where you were perpetually the stable one. The connections where your depth was admired but never genuinely met. These do not fall away because you failed them. They fall away because the selected line can no longer afford the frequency cost of sustaining what does not reciprocate the depth. The path operating through the separation process begins to make those connections increasingly difficult to maintain. You find yourself with less to say in conversations that once felt easy. You feel an exhaustion at the thought of showing up in spaces that once felt familiar. You notice that the effort required to stay in certain relationships has quietly become enormous, while the return from those relationships remains the same as it always was. This is not withdrawal disorder. This is not social anxiety. This is not evidence that you are becoming colder or more closed. This is your field refusing to continue subsidizing a relational model that has always required you to carry the greater share of the weight. The refusal is not hostile. It is intelligent. It is the selected line protecting what remains of its frequency for the next phase of the path, which requires that frequency to be intact, not depleted by continued extraction from relationships the separation has already outgrown. Here is what this looks like from the inside. You begin to feel a strange guilt around relationships you are quietly leaving behind, even though you are not consciously choosing to leave. You tell yourself you should be trying harder, you should be calling back sooner, you should be showing up more consistently. But every time you move toward those old connections, something in you resists in a way that cannot be explained through ordinary tiredness or ordinary avoidance. The resistance is not character failure, it is path intelligence. Your field already knows that the frequency cost of maintaining those connections is no longer balanced by what the path requires you to preserve for what is ahead. The guilt is real. But the guilt is being generated by an outdated relational script that says connection must be maintained regardless of whether it sustains both parties. The selected line operates under a different instruction. It operates under the instruction that frequency must be protected for what is actually aligned, even when that means releasing what was never genuinely calibrated to return it. That guilt deserves to be named precisely because it is one of the most reliable mechanisms by which selected lines are kept in place long past the point of genuine relational alignment. The guilt does not arrive randomly. It arrives because you were trained, early and repeatedly, to measure your own worth through your relational availability. To be good was to be present. To be loving was to be reachable. To be trustworthy was to never reduce the access others had to your frequency. The relational script that produced that guilt was not malicious. It was the operating model of an environment that benefited from your unlimited availability and reinforced it as virtue. The selected line absorbed that model and carried it forward, but the model was never calibrated to the frequency you carry. It was calibrated to maintain extraction. And the guilt you feel when you stop being as available as you once were is the sound of that old model resisting its own obsolescence. The resistance is real. The model is no longer accurate, and then there is the specific pain of the spiritual loneliness that follows. This is distinct from ordinary loneliness. Ordinary loneliness is resolved by the presence of people. Spiritual loneliness, the kind that arrives during a separation phase, is not resolved by company. You can be in a room full of people who love you in whatever way they are capable of loving, and still feel a particular kind of alone that has nothing to do with the number of bodies around you. It is the loneliness of frequency without a matching receiver. It is what happens when the depth you carry has no living correspondence in the environment you currently occupy. This loneliness is one of the most misread signals on a selected line. Most who feel it conclude that they are fundamentally unlovable, or that they are too difficult to truly reach, or that there is something about how they are built that will always produce this specific ache. None of these conclusions are accurate. The spiritual loneliness of the separation phase is not a diagnosis of your relational capacity. It is a geographic signal. It is telling you that the resonance you require does not exist in your current relational location. It is not saying the resonance does not exist. It is saying you have not yet arrived at the location where it lives. The Arcturian field observers track this loneliness as one of the most reliable indicators that root refinement is active, and that the selected line is being redirected towards something it cannot yet see, but is already moving toward. The loneliness is the gap between where you are and where the path is carrying you. It is painful precisely because the distance is real, but the distance is temporary. What it is not is permanent evidence of your relational deficiency. Now receive this final transmission clearly, because this is where the entire pattern locks into a single coherent truth, everything you have been calling rejection across the span of your relational life. The asymmetry, the one-sided giving, the people who took and could not return, the connections that dissolved without warning, the circles that felt like home until they suddenly didn't, the inexplicable spiritual loneliness even inside relationships, that on paper should have been enough. All of it was the same process viewed from different angles and different moments in time. It was never random. It was never a verdict on your worth. It was the selected line in contact with an environment it was always going to outgrow, experiencing the friction of that outgrowing as rejection, as loss, as failure, as personal flaw. You were not discarded. You were separated. There is a difference that must be understood before the next phase of the path can be walked with any clarity. Discarded means you were recognized and found insufficient. Separated means the frequency gap became structurally unworkable, and the path began correcting the mismatch before the damage became irreversible. The old circle did not leave because you were too much or not enough. The old circle left because the separation process finally made the gap undeniable, and the gap was always there. The leaving was not the beginning of the incompatibility. It was the incompatibility becoming too visible to sustain the pretense of fit. Say this aloud, only if you are ready. I was not discarded. I was separated. Let that distinction replace the older story. Not immediately, not without the resistance the older story will put up, but let it begin. Because the path that is ahead of you, the one the Arcturian field observers have already mapped in the direction your frequency is moving, cannot be entered while you are still identifying yourself as someone who was rejected. it can only be entered as someone who was separated, pruned, refined, and prepared. Someone whose old line had to lose its weight before the selected line could begin to carry only what it was built for. The separation is not finished, but you are no longer unaware of what it is. And awareness in this transmission is not the end. It is the activation of what has already been in motion. Before you scroll, leave one sign in the comments that this separation has already touched your life. It could be people falling away, the feeling of not belonging, repeated distance, unexplained isolation, or the sense that your old path no longer fits. Name it clearly. If this transmission recognizes something you have been carrying in silence, share it with someone who feels alone, cut off, or misunderstood, and cannot explain why. And if you are ready to understand the separation instead of blaming yourself, subscribe to Arcturian Chosen Path. You are not watching this by accident. You are recognizing a path already in motion. And this is only the beginning.